Hey peeps, welcome to a Homesteading Hustle, and today we're going to bake sourdough. And I'm going to take you step by step from start to finish on 2 beautiful loaves. Okay, so let's just jump right into it. This is the starter that we just finished making yesterday. If you followed along in my sourdough making experiment, this is the fresh new starter that we literally just made. And it is super bubbly. I have already fed it and it is ready to go. So I'm going to add 1/4, actually let's double it. So I'm going to double this recipe and we're going to do 1/2 cup of a starter. So I'll do 2 1/4 cup here. And this is the same recipe that I have used since I began making sourdough. Now when you find something that works, I just struggle veering from that. And I know that there is a ton of different recipes and methods and ways to do this, but this is what I have found that I've liked so far. Okay, and then we're going to add in 4.5 cups of water. Now you can give or take water a little bit depending on how hydrated your starter is. If you have a bit of a runny starter, you might want to use a little bit less water and add a little bit more as we mix it together to see if you have the right consistency. If you have a tighter, a little bit thicker of a starter, you can definitely use a little bit more water. Really, I'm not going to dive into hydration of a sourdough loaf. That is definitely an advanced method that I haven't really even tapped into figuring out the proper hydration. I just know that a loose, very hydrated dough is harder to work with, but it does provide a really awesome, soft, chewy texture to the sourdough. And if you have a little bit of a lower hydration loaf, it's just going to be easier to work with as far as scoring. You're definitely going to have more control with your loaf. It's not going to spread out on the counter. You'll have more time to score it and all of that. So as you see here, we're adding in flour. We're going to add in 8 cups of flour. And again, this is doubling it. So if you want to make just half of this recipe, you'll get 1 solid, really awesome loaf. Doubling it like this, I often can get 3 loaves in, just kind of depending on how big I want my loaves. This one we're going to do 2, and it's probably going to make 2 fairly decently sized loaves. I end up having to slice them and then slice the slice in half to make the toast that I like to do all the time. Now you can use whatever kind of flour that you want. I just highly recommend using an unbleached flour. So this is just a basic bread flour. It's unbleached and I have not sifted it. I have not found that sifting it is needed, but if you want to get real precise and real technical, go ahead and sift it. Whatever floats your boat. I am a busy mama and I try to make this happen as fast as possible so that we can have fresh bread in the house. So this is just the way that I do it, and you can, you know, change things, watch different videos, see how different people do it and all of that. So we're just going to give this a rough mix with, I like to use my hands. Your hands are going to be your best tool for any kind of bread making. That's just my personal opinion. You can use a dough whisk, which I actually have never had one up until this point. At the time of this video, I have not had some of these fancy tools that they have nowadays. So just give it a rough mix with your hands, and we want to give it its autolyse time, which is where the flour absorbs the water. And that's how it becomes incorporated into each other. So you want to have that initial time where it just gets to sit and absorb. And then we're going to sprinkle a little bit of salt on top. And this salt will get mixed in as we do our stretch and folds here in just a little bit. So this is about 2 tablespoons of just a basic kosher salt. Now I prefer the large granule salt like the kosher salt, but you can definitely use anything you like here. And then you're just going to cover it, and we're going to let it sit on the counter for an hour. Just to really allow that flour and water to incorporate into each other so that we can do some nice stretch and folds. Now I cover with just plastic wrap, and then I also do cover with a towel just because, you know, we have some indoor animals and let's just say they've gotten into things before. So go ahead and set that aside in a fairly warm spot for an hour. Okay, so our hour has passed and we're gonna uncover this. Now, once you let it sit for this period of time, again, it's called the autolyse time, it should have absorbed that water and become a little more of a cohesive unit here in the bowl. Now we're just going to do our stretch and fold. So you kind of reach your hand underneath the loaf, or underneath the dough, I should say, and you're going to pull it completely over itself, as I'm doing here. And you're just going to spin the bowl as you do these stretch and folds. Now, you're going to notice that the first little bit, it just kind of feels really wet, and it should be fairly easy to make this motion happen. And as you continue to do this, I mean, really right around maybe 20 stretch and folds, you'll start to notice that the dough starts to take a little bit of shape, and it has a little more of that gluten forming in it, which makes it a little harder to pull over around itself. These stretch and folds are really important for forming that gluten because that's what's going to give your bread structure. Now we're also, in addition to the structure, we're creating those tiny air pockets that is so well loved in sourdough. And we really don't want to compress those as we get further along in this process. Right now, it's no big deal. We're kind of really at the beginning stages. We haven't done a ton of proofing or fermenting yet. We're really just incorporating it. So as you see, it's tightening here, and I have switched from a one-hand to a two-hand stretch and pull. And I give it a little bit of a wiggle at the top, which helps the dough to stretch and then fold it over itself. And I do this a fair number of times. I mean, I haven't counted here how many times I've rotated this bowl around and how many stretch and folds I'm doing, but I like to get it to the point where it is actually very difficult for me to get the dough to fold over itself. And as I continue to go here, I mean, putting my hand in there and actually forcing the fold, I do this because, again, like I said, I'm a busy mama. I am often interrupted in this process, and I need to make sure that I'm getting as much as I can in the short period of time that I have to do it. Once you've completed this first round of stretch and folds, go ahead and cover it again, put your tea towel on top if you'd like, and set it aside. We're going to come back to this in just about 15 minutes. Okay, so our 15 minutes has passed and we are going to repeat this process again. Now you'll notice this time it's not going to be as loose as it was at the beginning of the last round. It's still going to have settled quite a bit in the bowl, but you're going to want to do the same thing as you did before. Reach underneath. A little tip that I have actually is I just got my hand wet here, and that helps to prevent it from sticking to your hand. If you have a very hydrated loaf, this will add a tiny more bit of water, so you may or may not want to do that. Completely up to you. Everybody's loaf is going to feel a little bit different as far as the texture goes. But yeah, just go ahead, rotate it around, and get as many stretch and folds as you can, and we will see how far we get here. I'll do a little time lapse for you on this round right now. So you remember how I said I was a busy mama and I often get interrupted in this process? That definitely happened, and I only did those 2 rounds of stretch and folds that you just saw. So no big deal. We just let it sit and proof all night and did our first bulk fermentation. So I literally just, after that last stretch and fold, I covered it, just how you saw, and I left it on the counter all night. Now this is the bulk fermentation, the first one, and so in the morning here we don't want to compress all these beautiful bubbles, and what you're going to do is obviously get the plastic wrap off. Mine stuck a little bit because I wasn't quite ready for it to do this process, but it's no big deal. It's going to be great. So we're going to flour our counter just a little bit, just enough to make it not stick heavily to the counter. And we're going to go around the bowl and just do a very gentle, I mean gentle, round of stretch and fold. So we're not really even stretching, we're just lifting it over itself, and you're going to feel how airy and light this dough feels. And you're going to feel all those little bubbles, and we don't want to compress those. We're really just getting it to the point where we can easily take it out of this large bowl. So go ahead and go around just one time and make sure it's all detached from the sides. And then we're going to plop it onto our lightly floured surface here. Now again, make sure that you do this gently because we don't want to heavily compress this dough or be too rough with it. Let's just be real gentle. We want to make sure. We have a vocal little lady next to me here, so she's going to give her own input on this sourdough. Do you have something to say? No? Okay. Oh man, kids are so incredibly sweet. Okay, so go ahead, grab a bench scraper or a dough cutter or whatever you'd like to call it, and just divide this dough as equally as possible in half. And you're going to set one half aside. You can just set it back in the bowl, and we're going to do a pre-shaping on this. All right, so we're going to set one of these aside, like I said. I'll just kind of give it a little bit of a fold over so that I have some of that flour around the outsides of it, so that when I put it back in the bowl here, it doesn't stick to the bowl heavily. So this is the one. We'll just set this aside right away. And we're going to do a little bit of a pre-shaping on this one. So you're going to just, again, if you need a little bit more flour, no big deal. Not too much. You don't want to incorporate a lot of dry flour into this. I have noticed that it provides a separation in the dough when you do that. And maybe that's just because I've been doing this for 2 years, but I'm still fairly novice at it. So give it a little bit of a stretch on the counter. And then we're going to fold it over itself. And you can do this kind of so many different ways. A lot of people fold it over itself twice like this, like in thirds. And then you grab one of the ends and you're going to just kind of roll it up. And again, we're not heavily pressing on it. We're just being real gentle with it. My dough is a little sticky. It is a little bit of a higher hydration loaf. No big deal. It just means that we're going to have less time to score it because it's going to want to kind of settle onto our counter when we get to that point. So just roll it up, and we're going to grab our banneton bowl, which I actually should have done this first, is kind of pre-floured this, but we're going to do this right now. Just give it a little bit of flouring inside there, and I actually heavily flour because I've had it stick to this banneton bowl before, and it is not fun if you have a surface that you want to score and it gets all jacked up because you didn't flour it enough. So I over-flour. That is completely up to you. You're going to have to experiment on this a little bit on how much flour you want to put in there. I could just use the same bread flour that we used for the inside of the dough. So I'm going to grab my loaf again. See, it did kind of settle back out. And I like to grab the corners and actually bring it into the center, almost like a dumpling. And then I have a nice smooth side on the other side. And that's the side you're going to put face down into your banneton, and then do a little bit of a cross stitch with your hands on the back side. You really just want the back side here that's going to be faced up to be connected as much as possible. Again, that helps create the structure on the finished loaf and allows it to stay together while it's doing its final proofing. Give it a little flour dusting on the top so it does not stick to the bag that we're going to put it in. And before we put it in the bag, I'm going to try to get as much of this flour off my hands as possible. And I thought I'd show you this little tip. If you have wet dough on your hands, if you actually take dry flour and just rub your hands together, as you know, just kind of back and forth, create that friction, it actually helps to get that dough off your hands without having to wash a ton down your drain. That is a huge issue in our house because my husband, it drives him crazy that I wash all this dough off my hands and down the drain. So as much as you can get onto your counter or into your garbage can, better for your drains. So for the sake of the video today, I'm going to line both of these bannetons with the liner and obviously do the flour coating, but you don't have to use a liner in a banneton bowl. You can just give the banneton a light coating of water, flour it, and you'll have really neat ridge lines around your loaf, which is really kind of a special way to use it. And then if you don't have a banneton, no big deal. Just use a glass bowl with a tea towel and then flour the tea towel. That's what I did when I first started. So we're going to take the other loaf here and do the same thing with it. As we're going to just kind of stretch it out over the table or counter here and stretch it onto itself. And, you know, you can play around with it. Clearly, I did this one a little bit differently. There's tons of different ways to do this. And again, I'm doing this busy mom style. We're not getting super fancy. I'm not baking artisan loaves here. It might look like one, but the process, real basic here. But create my little dumpling pouch, and that smooth side goes down into the floured banneton, and we'll do that little cross stitching again. And just make sure that underside stays taut together, and that will help create the structure and the final surface for when we'd like to score it. Okay, and again, just give this one a little bit of a light dusting of flour. You can use flour on your counter if you want so that doesn't go to waste. And we're going to put both of these into just a basic plastic bag. Everybody has those plastic bags laying around, just the basic ones you get from the grocery store. They're great for sourdough making, and they are what I have used all the way up until this point. And so we're just going to obviously get the dough off our hands. We're going to take the bag and we're going to put these inside of it. But first, we're going to cover it with parchment. Now, you don't have to cover it with parchment. You can just put it right into the bag. But because I'm going to bake it on parchment, this just allows one more thing that I don't have to do tonight when I go to bake these. So give it a little covering. You can fold it a little bit to match the edges of the banneton, and just place it in the plastic bag. So we're just, I'm gonna just slide it right into a bag here. I have like a Cub Foods bag. That's and that might be a Midwestern store here, but you know what I mean. You know what these are. Slide it in there, and you're going to close it by giving it a double knot on the side here. And this is going to be the last step before you can score your loaf. So this will go in the refrigerator, and I mean, you can do it as long as you want, really. I mean, I do this typically while I'm at work all day. So I will put it in the fridge once they're in these, because you want it to slow ferment at this point. So before we left it on the counter, this time we're putting these into the refrigerator or a cooler place, because we want it to slowly ferment at this point. And we're just developing flavor, and again, just a little bit more of that fermentation. So once you've tied these both off, put them in the fridge for anywhere between 4 and 10 hours. That's probably the sweet spot. Okay, so it is time to bake. So this is where you want to start preheating your oven. So turn it to 450, and you're going to end up baking this loaf for about 45 minutes. It probably has some moisture in it, some condensation, totally normal. And your parchment at this point is probably going to be a little bit soft and a little bit wet, no big deal. We're actually just going to turn it over onto the parchment. Now, this is where we're going to score the loaf. So this is the fun part, but you're gonna wanna work quickly and confidently. So I didn't really have this planned out how I was going to score this loaf, so we're just gonna kind of roll with it. But you want to give it a little bit of a little more flour powder dusting on the top. And what that does is it creates that contrast of where this loaf will open and yeah, the surface. So it kind of helps create that pretty design. So give it a nice even coating, and then we're going to do our scoring. So I'm going to do a first cut, which is going to be the expansion score, and that is going to be your long score that extends for most of the width of your bread. You can do it right down the center, you can do it off to the side. They do say that going at an angle a little bit and having it between 1/4 and 1/2 inches best. Then we're going to put our little design on the side. If you want, you don't have to do a design, but I'm going to do the traditional wheat stock here. This is one that you see on so many loaves nowadays. And we're just using a bread lame, and you can just use a razor blade if you'd like. Sometimes I will put an additional small score line in between my design and the expansion score, which creates a little bit of a barrier to keep my design intact. So put it into a covered pan and plop it in the oven, right on that parchment paper. You'll keep that in there. Okay, here's the moment of truth. It's beautiful. So it is really fun to see a finished loaf right out of the pan here. Now, this parchment is going to be brittle, and so grabbing it out of here doesn't quite work, especially for me. I mean, unless you use a huge piece of parchment. A dough sling is on my list of things to get, and so that will be essential. But I'm just going to turn this over onto my hot pad and then onto my counter and just admire this beautiful loaf. They're always so fun to see, and it is really hot. So I am going to use these hot pads to move it over to a cooling rack, and do not cut into that right away. You will compress all those little bubbles. So just go ahead, and while your oven is still going, get your other loaf ready to go, just like we did this one. So we're going to tear into the bag and do the same thing. I will once again do a little time lapse for you on this one. We'll do a very similar score structure, and we'll see how they all turn out at the end. Okay, so we baked this loaf on Friday night, but I ended up baking it really late, and you really don't want to cut into your sourdough while it's hot, because you will actually deflate all those beautiful holes that you made inside. So you want to make sure you completely cool it before you cut into it. So it is Sunday now, so I've waited way too long. I wanted to cut into this much earlier than this, but life happened and other things came before this, so this will be the grand finale. We will just cut into this loaf and see what kind of results we have in the crumb. So when you cut into your loaf and you see all the beautiful holes inside, that is called your crumb. And we're gonna see how beautiful this one looks. I did give away the other loaf that I made. I gave that one to my dad, so hopefully he enjoys it. We're gonna go ahead and cut this open, and I'll show you up close what it looks like. So the fun thing about cutting a loaf within a short period of time after it's baked, obviously you want it to be completely cooled, but if you don't have to store it before you cut it, you have that really nice crunchy, crispy crust that makes that crackle sound that everybody loves. But I did have to store this one, so it definitely has a nice solid structure on the outside, but it doesn't have that crackle like a fresh loaf does. So we're just gonna give this a slice down the center, and I will show you up close. It turned out really pretty. Let's see if you can see the detail in there. So you wanna make sure when you're baking sourdough, obviously that you don't have, well, I guess everybody's preference is gonna be a little differently. But I like to make toast with mine, and I like to have not huge huge air pockets that are open. I kind of like evenly dispersed crumb. And this one looks pretty good. So this is with the starter that we just made, and I am very happy with these results. I mean, look at the rise on that. That is a legit, I mean, this is a big loaf, but that is a legit 4.5 inches high. That's a really great rise. So I would say that this experiment was a success. So I totally messed up with my direction of cutting. But that's okay, it's not a huge deal, unless you're a sourdough person and you totally geek out about all the details. So usually you want to, when you slice your sourdough, you want to find the ear, which is where it is opened up the most on the top of your sourdough, which is where most of the air and gases have escaped. And that's what's called the ears, when it has a nice large lip. And usually you want to cut it against that ear so that when you open it up you get like a bunny ear, which is, and so I cut it the wrong way, so I'm going to give you half of it. You can kind of see here, this is like a bunny ear. Like, I don't know if you can see because I jacked it up, but it's okay.